Hello, I'm Marissa Martino, certified dog behavior consultant in Boulder, Colorado, and you're listening to the Paws and Reward podcast, where dog training and personal growth meet. On the show, we stop and reflect on ourselves, the human-canine bond, improving the relationships with our loved ones, and behavior change strategies for you and your dog. Hello, everyone. There are 2 more days until the cart closes for the Reflective Relationship Program. It's going to close tomorrow, April 11th at 9 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So please visit pawsandreward.com/relationship to sign up and get your spot. If you don't know what the Reflective Relationship Program is, it is my 3-month live intensive program where we explore ourselves through the relationship with our dogs. This program cultivates the necessary human end of the leash skills for successful training sessions, sustainable behavior change, and connected relationships. This program is designed to expand your self-awareness through education, deep inquiry, and exercises with your dog. You'll gain a deeper relationship with your dog, and more importantly, yourself, a productive mindset, and an integrated experience with my 6 connection principles. So again, visit my website, pawsandreward.com/relationship. Cart closes tomorrow, April 11th, 9 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and I hope to see you inside the program. Hello, listeners. I am thrilled to have Belinda Breen on the podcast today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Belinda and I are laughing because our topic today is about grief. And we're not laughing at grief, but we are laughing that we were recording this without it recording. And so we're experiencing grief that the original podcast discussion that we were having that was beautiful, that we'll recreate, was not recording. So Belinda made this, I was like, oh gosh, I'm in such resistance that wasn't recording. And Belinda was like, well, it's kind of what we're talking about. I'm like, you're right. You're absolutely right. So before we get started, who do you share your life with and what's your favorite thing about them?
Yes. So I have a 13-year-old border collie named Heidi, and who I share my life with. And my favorite thing about her is that she is does a great job of consistently reminding me to be in the present moment, which isn't easy. And she's had many struggles throughout the years. And so being with her in that journey and being with myself in that journey too has been just a multiple times a day reminder to come back to what's here now.
Yes, be here now, always. Thank you for sharing that. So we are talking about grief today. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Belinda on is because Belinda not only is a dog behavior professional, but she's also getting her doctorate in clinical psychology. And so I thought you were the perfect person to talk about this topic that is, I think, so important. And it's interesting. I would not talk or think or experience grief with a 10-foot pole until last year, until I actually lost my dog. And now I'm fascinated with grief, and now I want to talk about it. I want to experience it. I want to give it some airtime, because I know that we experience grief in a variety of different ways, living with and caring for our dogs. So whether it's that we're saying goodbye to a loved one, whether we're making a hard rehoming decision, whether we are saying goodbye to a lifestyle or a picture we had in our mind about living with our dog, whether we're saying goodbye to the idea of who our dog is or is not. And so all of that is, you can sort of boil it down to a loss of something. So talking about grief, I think, is really important for all of us, because it is part of living, caring for our dogs. And there's a lot of grief in the training and behavior modification process. So, how are we defining grief? Like, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think psychology might define it a number of ways, and there's amazing researchers who are specifically looking at grief, and so there's different models of grief. But one thing I thought about when you asked the question was that's sort of the trouble with grief, isn't it? That it's hard to define, and it feels maybe vague and unpredictable, and in
Unpredictable
that,
is a good one.
yeah,
Hmm.
and in that way hard to be with.
Yeah, unpredictable is such a good one because everyone's always talking about like, ride the waves or like I get startled by my grief. Like I'll have a day where I'm feeling so good and then it hits me in a way that like it comes without shadow a lot of the times. And I think that's what I do feel like people have, and some of my clients have reported feeling shame around that they're still grieving something,
Mm.
whether it is a loss of a dog or a loss of a lifestyle or because of their dog's behavior concerns. So, but I don't think grief is like a lot of things in life is not linear, right? Like it's not this beginning, middle, and end process that we're in.
Right. And I don't know about you, but certainly in my experience, it feels as though it sneaks up on you.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's
Maybe, yeah.
very, no, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, maybe not in times where one might expect to be feeling grief, maybe you're a little bit more like, okay, I'm going to feel some sort of way. But I've certainly had times where the loss has happened a while ago and grief kind of sneaks up on you when you aren't exactly maybe thinking about it or expecting it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because one of my I worked with a grief coach when I lost Sully, and and that was really really powerful. And it was a lot of somatic stuff. Like it was a lot of breath work, a lot of just holding space for the grief. And one of the things that she told me, which I thought was beautiful, was I'm not always going to be able to sit with grief, right? Like it's like not only is it uncomfortable and scary, but I'm like in the middle of a podcast recording or right, like life goes on, right?
Yes.
um and one of the things that she said was to at least acknowledge it, right? Like if I'm feeling it well up in my chest, which is usually where the sensation happens, if I'm feeling it, that I could say something to myself like, grief, I see you. Now is not the time. I will come back to you like later this afternoon or later this evening when I have the space to fully experience you.
Hmm.
And I've been in the practice of doing it more recently where it's like, oh, I feel you and I got to hop on a call right now. Like just to acknowledge the emotion can be so powerful because I do feel like we are really good at distracting ourselves from feeling these emotions, especially these emotions are really uncomfortable, right? Like and I'll just speak for myself that I notice that there are specific behaviors that I engage in that either numb me out or they soften my emotional experience or they distract me from my emotional experience. Um, so like the number one thing I think of is like Netflix, like having Netflix in the background, like something to distract me from feeling all the feels,
Hmm.
right? And I there is like I don't want to shame myself for that, right? Because it's like, okay, it's too big for me to hold right now. I need something. And I also do want to give, like when I'm available, when I'm ready to give that emotion space. Because if I keep pushing it down, it's like holding a balloon underwater and it's going to come up at some other point. Right? Would
Hmm.
you agree with that given your background and your studies?
Yes, absolutely. I think also the other piece that I might add is just the social political climate that we're in currently, but also the way our society is. There's not a lot of space or encouraged ritual around loss. And I think a way many systems are set up is to not acknowledge loss. Um, so there's that piece too, and I'm mentioning that I think because when we're feeling that way, we're also it's on a personal level, and it's also we're also impacted by this environment that we're in.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of, either I'm trying to avoid it, or some of my clients will engage in, especially if we're on a training and behavior modification journey. So they're going to lose something. They're going to lose maybe access to off leash, or they're grieving the fact that their dog is reactive and they can't walk in their neighborhood, or they're grieving the fact that they have so much on their plate now, right? Like it's just is a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
And I do notice that some of my clients that are really dedicated to their dogs and they're on all the training platforms, they're really um they're really focused on fixing the thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like and it comes from wonderful intentions, right? Like they're all so incredible and they want better welfare for themselves and their dogs, and they like primarily their dogs, and they are really trying to they put all this energy into trying to fix it, right? And it's almost like a yes and, right? It is like that is so amazing, and there is some grief here that we might be moving away from, or um yeah, trying to avoid, because like that feels um unclear, like you said about grief, like that feels nebulous and not tangible, but like doing a enrichment protocol, that feels really tangible, and that feels really, really good, right?
Yeah.
So I see my clients sort of leaning towards the doing a lot, and myself included, versus sort of being with what's coming up throughout the process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ugh,
Yeah.
I have so many different associations as you're saying it. I mean, one thing we were chatting about before we started recording was yeah, that this piece about there's different levels of it. On one level, there's this avoidance of maybe feeling those harder things. And we were chatting some too about how it speaks to this deep desire humans have to connect. And I had mentioned Freud earlier for the reason of just saying that people have been thinking about this for some time, where
Mm-hmm.
um, you have a person, you have an animal, you have energy that you're directing towards that person or animal, and what happens when um, you lose them.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that energy go? And that was stuff that they were writing about at the start of psychology. But um, one question that came up as you were sharing that also for me was what might be hard to be with in those
Mm-hmm.
moments, right? So when we're so focused on completing the thing or doing the thing correctly, we also, I think, want to have a lot of compassion for ourselves um, or whoever we're working with, and some curiosity around like how doing also ties into one's idea of oneself. So not only do we live in this hyper productive
Mm-hmm.
um, world and society, but if we had any sort of early losses, neglect, abuse growing up, I might argue that we're going to be even more inclined to be pretty focused on doing and to tie our identity to doing too. So if I'm achieving, if I'm completing the training plan, if my dog's now behaving exactly as I wanted them to behave, um, that means I'm okay in some way.
Yeah.
And
There's a lot there. Yeah.
there's a lot there, and it can be so threatening then when either we as trainers or other animal professionals who are working with clients come in and want to tamper with that because it is a coping strategy and it's
Mm-hmm.
worked and it's damn good um,
Yep.
at at getting what that person needs in that moment too. So I love this piece that you're bringing in about noticing, and we're sort of talking about being present with what's there, but sometimes even asking the question of um, what might I be not wanting to look at right now is too hard a question to ask, and so we have to meet the person in that place too.
Yeah, like I think you mentioned before we were recording that like sometimes it's like I mentioned earlier, it's just too big. It's too big to be with in that moment and that's okay, right? Like we always make a plan and work with dogs where they're at emotionally, right? We're always saying, okay, that's we got to shift the environment because you're over threshold. I know that because of A, B, and C, and I'm going to modify the environment. I want to make sure that you feel safe. We're always meeting the dog where they are. And so then it's like an invitation to always meet ourselves where we are, right? Like if I'm like, yeah, I can't sit with grief right now, it's too big, or my client can't sit with grief right now, or they're indicating that they don't want to sit with it at all. It's like no problem, right? It's not really our place to push them to experience that. It really is about, um, yeah, I mean, grief is a part of it, and so we want to meet ourselves and meet our clients, meet our dogs where we are at, where we have the capacity to be.
Yes. And you saying it that way too is making me think of something we touched on a little bit earlier before recording around one of the challenges, I think, being an animal behavior professional who's working with folks who are caring for an animal is that all sorts of stuff is going to get activated in us seeing somebody suffering, seeing the animal suffering and seeing the person suffering. And so when stuff starts to get activated in us, we're going to be inclined to um, act a certain way with the client.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that can look like being super directive. And that also is an avoidance of feeling our own stuff around whatever's getting activated in seeing this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, so we can do that. We can sort of be overly directive with the client, um, or we might go the other direction and just sort of dissociate to maybe what they're experiencing and maybe be less attuned to them in that way too. But part of what you and I were chatting about before was um, one way I had approached animal training was, or the way I sort of conceptualized it when I was working with folks, was that part of my job was being able to be aware enough of what was happening in those moments that I wasn't increasing or perpetuating the client's anxiety by also becoming anxious or also becoming attached to a certain fantasy that the client had about their dog, their lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
but to really be able to, and this is why I think working with humans and animals in the capacity that animal behavior professionals do is such a healing profession because I think
Mm-hmm.
you are required in many ways to have this capacity to hold all that
Mm-hmm.
psychologically or psychically to be able to meet the person then, as you're saying, where they're actually at, and that's not always easy.
Yes. Yeah, I mean there's so many times I can think back when I was working with clients where I was getting in the way, right? Like I wasn't being present to what is because what was coming up for me, like being in that experience, whatever was happening with the dog or the client or the family, like that environment was impacting my thoughts and impacting my emotions. And then like I've said this on the podcast before, if I am feeling less than, talk about we were talking about identity and attached to all that. If I was feeling less than or had a story around that, then I would I wouldn't get over directive. I would just fill the space, and I would over and I would talk. And it was a specific behavior strategy for me to feel important or feel that I was giving them what they needed in order to protect them from experiencing their level of grief or their level of sadness around fill in the blank topic, right? And man, like that is such a circular, like nebulous thing that we're in. Um, and it wasn't until I worked with a therapist and a coach to really go like, oh wow, I'm bringing a lot into the table that has nothing to do with management strategies, training and behavior modification protocol. Like I'm bringing all this other stuff
Yeah.
into our dynamic that really might not be serving me, my client, or the dog. And again, no shame around that, just awareness that like, that, that's curious. Is that serving us right now? It's not. What else could I be doing, or what other mindset could I have, or what other behaviors might be more supportive in this process? And knowing that like I have a learning history of feeling less than, right? And so I'm probably going to engage in these behaviors. I'm not going to get it right now that I have the awareness. Like I think that's a hard thing for some people to swallow too, is like when you learn something about yourself, it's really empowering. But then then you have the fantasy that you'll get it right, like
Right.
moving forward. And it's like, hey, this is lifelong practice, right? So I can
Yes.
definitely relate to what you're saying about how I've gotten in the way a bit um, when working with clients and just being aware of that.
But too, as you're saying that, it reminds me of, I think people who work with animals generally tend to be um, attuned and sensitive
Mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm,
subtle changes.
mm-hmm,
And that's such a superpower animal behavior professionals have. And so, one way I hear what you're saying also is that, as you were sharing, I thought, of course you felt that way. Of course you felt that way. Because, yes, there's the stuff that we might be bringing in, but you're also holding these sort of the nonverbal stuff that's
mm-hmm,
happening in the situation. And if we are particularly attuned, then we're also at times going to start to feel what the client is feeling, but we're going to mistake it as our own stuff rather than recognizing that, oh, because I'm so attuned, this is what it feels like to be this person right now. And I'm getting a felt sense of that. So in a way,
mm,
it's like, one way I think of it is like it allows us to kind of level up in our work with the client because we have these moments of getting a real idea of what it might be like to be really as distressed as they are.
mm. Yeah, what I hear you saying, it's almost like you take something in from the environment, and because we're talking about grief, let's say it's grief. What I hear you saying is that like we can experience what the client is feeling, but not take it on as our own.
Yes,
So sort of asking the question, like, is this mine?
yes.
Or is this the client's? Or is this both? Right.
Mhm.
Because it's not always so clear. But can I see and witness the client, witness their grief while not being swallowed up by it? And then doing all of these behaviors or engaging in this pattern that I have done that might, again, not be as productive. Right. Right.
Right, right. Yes, this point about when we are defending against a sense of loss or a feeling of depression, one way to cope with that is by um, activating a lot of energy. And as you're
Mm-hmm,
saying, channeling that into a lot of doing. And
mm-hmm,
sometimes that manifests as in an interaction, we're talking a lot, we're giving
mm-hmm,
like a
mm-hmm.
ton of information about why this is the way to do this thing, or, this sort
Yeah,
of stuff.
totally.
Um, and that is sort of a clue for us then that as you're saying, maybe there's something that I've lost here or that's feeling hard to be with. And me engaging in these behaviors in this way is an indication that something's going on for me. And not
Mm-hmm.
that we have to change it in that moment and, okay, you need, stop talking so much, stop doing so much,
Yeah.
but more that, that we could talk to ourselves in that moment and say, wow, something must be really hard for you right now because you're staying busy.
Yeah. I'm just curious as behavior professionals, right? The stuff that we cannot sit with our clients might be stuff that we also cannot sit with in our own lives, right? For me, the way I'm going to sit with a client losing their dog is very different now that I have sat in it. Like I have more space or more capacity to hold that emotion. I'm not great at it, but I have a little bit more space than before.
Mm-hmm.
I just have more capacity to do that now because I have faced it. And so, would you agree with that perspective?
Yes, and the tricky irony of that too is that we don't know what we don't know, and so there are going to be ways that we interact with clients where, in hindsight, we might think, "Oh yeah, I think I went that route with them because um, I didn't know about this yet, or I didn't know about
Mm-hmm.
this part of me yet."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, which maybe, I think one of the reasons you and I have gravitated towards one another over the years is because we're very interested in this subtle process that happens and
Yeah.
that isn't always talked about in animal behavior work, um, where I think you and I make an argument for how this work can't be done without some level of this kind of reflection. Um,
Totally.
because it's there, whether folks acknowledge that it is or not, it
Mm-hmm.
is there. And you and
Yeah.
I think like talking about it and naming it
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that you're saying that word, naming it, because yeah, I mean, you can absolutely go through life without naming or being with this stuff. Absolutely. Like that is a way to live. And there's no problem with that. Right. I think you and I, yeah, we have gravitated to one another because we geek out about this stuff. Cause we're like, it's like the magic dust in the air. And it's not fun to look at, right? Like when you choose a life that you're like, gosh, I want to be aware of what is going on, it can be painful. There's a lot of grief in that actually. Like there's a lot of grief and like, oh, like you said, I'm looking back and going, oh, I didn't wish I would have handled that differently with that client. And um, yeah, there can be a lot of grief when we're looking at everything through an aware, awake lens. Um, but yeah, that stuff is there for sure.
Yeah. And I think it, as you're saying too, it has an impact on the work that we do. And so um, although it's hard to engage in, and maybe feels weird that we talk about this stuff when we're talking about training an animal, um, but that it also opens things up for us, I think, in a way where we can put language to things that haven't been named. And in that way, um, we have more, I was going to use the word control, but I don't know if that's quite it. It's like we have more available to us, I think, when
Yeah.
we're able to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I feel it's like if I'm looking through binoculars, it's just like I can see way more or something. That's not really a great analogy, but it's like um no, if I'm looking through binoculars just at like fixing the behavior problem and not naming everything, then I have a narrow lens, right? Versus if I put the binoculars down and take a look and see everything, it's like, oh wow, there's a lot contributing to this situation than I thought, which can be, as a behavior professional, can be overwhelming. You're like, whoa, and I'm juggling this and it's all the stuff in the nonverbal, like you were talking about. Like there's a lot here. Um,
Yes. I was thinking too about burnout in our field,
mhm.
in animal behavior and for animal professionals, and how I think one of the benefits for me of building this way of thinking more, is that it has made the work more sustainable because you're moving out of this paradigm of, oh, I just need to give the person A, B, C, and D, and then their dog or animal is going to be fixed, and then they'll be happy,
Hmm.
and I'll be on to the next client. It's like,
Totally.
that's not how it works. Um, yeah. So I think it can give you a lot of freedom as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because I have heard that behavior professionals are like, oh, I don't want to hold all of this or take a look at all of this. And I love that reframe that you're saying is that like, well, if we're just narrow, right? We've got the binoculars on, we're just really narrow. It does have a mindset that like things will be easy and linear.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it's not the case. I keep joking that like I wrote the universe, she has ghosted me. I have a suggestion in her suggestion box that things be a little bit more linear and no response as of yet. Or many
Right.
responses telling me that that's not what's happening. So,
Yes, yes. Well,
so
again, oh yeah.
no good.
I was going to say it's, kind of meta level here. It's
Uh-huh.
again, we're going back to this grief. It's like
Hmm.
that it's hard to be life and people and certainly animals are um in my view, like part of the beauty of and the rawness of humanity and nature is that it's this combination of contradictions.
Mm.
And if we're going to pretend like it's not as fun to live that way. And so when we start to acknowledge that that's the case, then there can be so much more room to say things, but also to think things. And I'm just a fan of that.
Yes. Thank you for stating it that way. It is the yes and, right? It's like it is this way and it is also this way. And there's something about, I mean, my brain personally, but I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, brains in general, where we're wanting to just make it so black and white and grip to the one thing. And um, yeah, I have a list of reminders that I read every day that is like, you know, embracing the contradiction because I it's uncomfortable for me. Like I'm just like, wait,
Yeah.
what? I want to hold on to this one thing. And if I do all the things that I said I was going to do, then I will feel free from grief. And it's like, oh, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work like that.
Yes. And I do want to speak to the neuroscience piece too
Mm-hmm.
around this, that um, because, right, we don't want to get into this mindset of, oh, I just, need to think differently and then I won't feel this grief or it won't be as bad or something. But from the brain standpoint, it's like you have all these connections when you have a connection with a person or an animal. And then when they're no longer there, the brain has to make sense of that. And that grieving process is in part so painful because the brain is trying to figure out what this means.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I don't know how other people would experience this, but when I think about it that way, it's easier for me to have compassion for myself or for somebody else going through that process then, because really down to a biological, organic level,
Yeah.
it's painful and
Mm-hmm.
confusing.
Yeah. And, we were talking about grief comes without shadow, right? And like, I did want to talk a little bit about the 5 stages of grief, because I think that also gets a little bit like nebulous and uncomfortable. And, yeah, it can be really painful because it shows up in these different ways. And so can you share a little bit about what the 5 stages are?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with like Dr. Kubler-Ross's work as of recently. But yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about each stage and what that might
Hmm.
look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to start us
Yeah,
off
sure.
maybe giving an overview?
Sure. So the first, and from my understanding, there is not, again, it's not linear.
That's right.
It's not
That's right.
like in May, I'm going to go through denial. And then in
Right.
June, I'm going to go through
Right.
anger, right? But it is denial, anger, bargaining,
Mhm.
depression, and acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we can just briefly talk about each.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so denial is actually the very first psychological defense we develop as humans. So Before we learn how to use humor, before we learn how to think all good, all bad, we have denial.
Mm.
So it's like our infant defense.
Mm-hmm.
And we use denial, when I think about it that way, then too, we use denial then when the level of pain that we're experiencing is um, arguably taking us back to something that's very, very, very old in us,
Mm.
right? So we don't want to be with something. We don't want to look at it. It's a complete not pretending, that doesn't do it justice at all, but this thing is so hard, I can't be with it. And so I can't acknowledge that it exists.
Yeah.
And as you said, this pops up that it's not linear and that it comes up at different parts in the process and it can last for varying lengths of time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so interesting that it can be rooted in something that's so painful. Like that makes sense, right? It's like, what would be the opposite of looking at it, completely not even acknowledging it, right? It's like I'm envisioning this like pendulum swing that is like, if I look at it or I just don't even acknowledge that it exists, right? And
Yeah.
I have, as you say it like that, man, I have a lot of compassion for um certain people that have denied acknowledging something. And I always felt maybe like gaslit about that experience. Like, wait, can't you see the thing? Right. And now that you say it that way, it's like, oh, wow, it is such a coping mechanism. Like, it is such a thing to grasp onto, to be like, I can't even look at that. Right. So to have compassion for someone. So whether it is our clients like, oh no, the dog and the child are totally fine. And you're like, like this is really risky to have this dog and child together. And they're just like in complete denial, because what would that mean? Right. Like acknowledging that the dog would need to be rehomed or acknowledging that the child might get hurt. Like that is just so painful.
Yeah.
So there might just completely be in denial about it. That makes a ton of
Yes.
sense.
Yes. It also has one thing denial comes along with is disconnection then in relationship. So as you were talking about, sometimes we interact with people where they're using a lot of denial, but let's say they're using a lot of denial, not just maybe with their animal and their child, but it's sort of pervasive throughout their way of coping in the world. It can feel very gaslighty to interact with somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and somebody like that develops because of very, very early loss of connection with a caregiver. So their way of surviving in the world has been to not be in touch with reality. And that's why it can be so challenging then when we're interacting with them as an adult. If you're trying to point out something that maybe you and other people would agree on is reality, this person can't see that because their
Yeah.
whole structure and survival structure, personality structure is built around not being with the thing that's really painful to see.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So the next one is anger, which I find this particular one can be expressed in a way that is sort of misplaced. Like for me, when I lost Sully and then I was trying to find my next dog, I was really angry about the process. I was really angry about that like I couldn't find my right dog. I was like angry that like the foster dog didn't work out. Like there was so much emotion. And it was a little bit like you had used the word before, like not manic, but there was like so much energy behind getting another dog. And it was like, oh, Marissa, is this some grief also mixed in here? Like I didn't look at it that way.
Yeah.
And a few people were like, this feels a little imbalanced, or, then they all did it with love. Where is all this coming from? And I mean, I did experience anger. I felt like it was, I don't know if it's right to say, and I'd love your opinion, like misplaced grief, because like anger is a stage of grief,
Mm,
but it was like that misplaced energy that I was feeling, and then
mm,
it manifested as anger.
mm. I guess one model of emotions is to view emotions as messages about our nervous system. So
Mhm.
anger's message is typically that a boundary has been violated, and so it's very important that we as humans and as animals can get in touch with that sort of feeling. Um, and so when I think about it, then in the context of grief, I think about how there's an unfairness to grief.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Something's not right. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. And in that way, it is a sort of violation of,
Yes. Yes.
um, yeah,
Like an unspoken boundary, or like a an expectation you had. Yes. I love looking at through that.
so much. I have so much, I don't know if the right word is, but like awe that like we've evolved to have this incredible thing called anger that's like telling us, like, yeah, this is not right. Um, and
Mm,
for some of us, it's much easier to tap into anger, um, or to express anger than it is for others. And I don't just mean like on a psychological level, but I also mean like on a social level. Like certain identities have certain privileges around expressing anger. And so I think
mhm.
that's another piece we can think about with ourselves too. Like what has been my relationship to anger? Yeah.
Excellent point. Bargaining is the next one. I'm gonna say bargaining. I don't really know what bargaining is. Is it sort of like,
I think it's like kind of like contingency management is one way I think about it, where like, okay, if this happens, then this.
mm,
If I give this, then this. Um, it's sort of there's a I mean, the word that comes to my mind is like there's an energy of desperation because in this moment where we've tried maybe these other things and it's like, okay, there's a sort of there can be an element of kind of like magical thinking. That's what we sometimes would say in psychology, where there's a feeling of maybe we're not totally aware of it, but there can be a feeling of like omnipotence. Like if I just think this thing, it can happen. If I just think about this a certain way, then it's going to happen. This idea that you have more power really than you do in the situation.
mm. Yeah, that can get really tricky, right? Because then that you're just looking at it through one lens and maybe hoping too hard, and or like gripping to that one lens, and
Well,
might be not looking at at all pieces of the reality.
yes. And there's a real sweetness to it too, because it's maybe the first stage or one of the stages where you're trying to take responsibility.
Mm.
You're trying to say, okay, if I change this thing, if I'm involved in it in this way, then it's going to be different. Whereas denial isn't really structured that way.
Yes, I see the difference between the two. Interesting. I'm even seeing this just in like everyday like I'm looking at myself through these five stages, and just even in
Yeah,
human interactions, right? Like it doesn't have to be like
absolutely.
grief equals loss, right? Loss of a loved one, or right. It is like I said, I think that there's grief and or impermanence, if you want. I mean, they're not the same concept, but they are, I feel like, cousins in some way, or they hang out together, grief and impermanence. I have grief that there is impermanence, right? So there's something there, and I can see that. I can see all these stages and some of my behavior in all of them. So the next one is
Yeah.
depression.
Where to start? There's so many places we
I
could
know,
start with
I know.
this. Yeah, so again, I'll tie in something that Freud talked about, just to take us way back. Depression is really Freud sort of viewed the difference between depression and melancholia.
Mm-hmm.
So one way I think about this is depression is getting in touch with the loss. And what you and I have been talking about up to this point is sort of these strategies that we might find ourselves using, not consciously even, to avoid the loss. And so depression, in a way, is a real achievement. Um, we even think about this in terms of human development as children are growing up. We come to terms with this idea that the world is nuanced. And in some circles, we call that the depressive position. When we start to become aware that, oh, it's not all good, it's not all bad. So there's an acknowledgement of nuance. There's a holding of both.
Mm. I love how you talk about emotion, and because there is such a like my mind with my experience will go straight to, "Ooh, that's a bad emotion to feel, right? Or that's a good emotion to feel, right? A lot of us are like, we want to feel, we've got books, the happiness project, like how can we be 10 ways to be more happy, right? And so there's just a beauty in how you talk about emotion. Like depression is an achievement, right? Like you're saying that you are sitting with, you are being with, um and that is an achievement, right? Because it's something that, speak for myself, will avoid doing, right? And so when you are depressed, I would imagine depression and maybe acceptance, like going through depression to get to acceptance almost, right? Like it's being with and understanding that, yeah, I'm not bargaining, I'm not angry, I'm not in denial about it. I am just being with. And I love that you talk about, um, like we all know the shadow side to depression, but like you're also talking about the light side of depression, right? That like it can be a gift in some way.
Yes, yes. Because the opposite, if we're thinking in terms about like our own development, um, the opposite is to be in a very sort of a survival state, a
Mm-hmm.
sort of things are being done to me when, so what I'm trying to describe is like when we're when we're having a difficult time being with um, a depressive state, and this is different. I should say too, this is different than um, something like major depressive disorder or any of the depressive disorders. I'm talking more about an intrapsychic state, so times where we feel very low, and that could be different than clinical depression.
Mm-hmm.
But
Thank
the
you for that clarification. I was feeling the
yeah,
need to, like, in case anyone was listening, I was feeling the need to differentiate that as well. So thank you for that.
yeah, yeah. So what we're really talking about here is exactly that, being in touch with more of a loss. And when we have yet to be in that, sort of the other side of the coin with that is being in a place of survival, where it's either this way or it's that way. um, and so that's why I talk about it there as like an achievement, because we're moving out of this state of um, doing something to somebody or something being done to us. We're moving into this more like, oh, there's sort of both.
Mm-hmm.
um there was this love, and there were also things that were hard for me about this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then the last one is acceptance.
Yeah, yeah, I know where to start with this one too.
Acceptance to me feels different than resignation, right? Like resignation, I feel like my hands are tied. I feel, when I think about the word resignation, like it's like I have no control. But when I think about acceptance, there is a level of there's a level of peace that I don't control it,
Yes.
that I can't control it. Um, yeah, acceptance to me feels peaceful, although resistance is, I feel like resistance is part of that denial and the anger and the bargaining.
Mm.
Resistance can feel so attractive to me sometimes. Like there's a lot of doing behind, like I'm going to resist this and then therefore I'm going to do it and fix it and whatever. But acceptance is, yeah, it feels more peaceful. It feels, um, it is the yes and it is the allowing for the emotion.
Absolutely. And if somebody's encouraging us to be in acceptance before we're really there, it can feel like a threat to our agency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think when there's an avoidance of acceptance, part of the reason for that is what you're saying, that it feels like a loss of control. And when we want to rebel or resist against something, part of the reason we're um, digging our heels in that way is because we want to take control of the situation. We want to have agency again. We're feeling that sort of loss. Um, but I also hear this piece about you saying that like when you have felt acceptance, it doesn't feel so much like a loss of agency. If anything, it
Mm-hmm.
feels as though um, not that you're in more control, but that you don't need to do something anymore, that you can just be.
Yeah, it's more, it feels empowered in a way. Um, it's funny that you bring up the agency piece. So I have my 6 connection principles that I talk about with my clients, and one of them used to be acceptance.
Mm,
And I removed it because my coach and I talked at length about how, like, if we're talking about acceptance, you also have to accept non-acceptance, right? And so I remember being like, yeah, like teaching my clients how to accept something when they're not ready is not okay. And so I removed it as one of my
mm,
principles. It shows up in my principles in multiple different ways, but it is not like pushed upon. And it's like I love that you bring that up because we had so many long talks about my principles that I was like, oh yeah, that doesn't feel good. Like
mm,
nobody wants to just get over it or let it go or like it when you're not ready, right? Like that
yeah,
doesn't, that is pushing past your experience.
yeah, yeah. And we know so much about that. We know so much about how humans change and why they change. And
Mm-hmm.
in that, we know that we can't make people change.
Mm-hmm.
They'll change when they've decided that that's what they want to do, that it aligns with their values, and
Mm-hmm.
they're going to move forward despite it being painful because that's what matters to them. Um,
Yeah. Thank you. Um, so last question I had was about community. We were talking a lot about, or you had mentioned earlier that we don't have systems or rituals. Like I mean, we have some, but grief is really, sort of the elephant in the room a lot of the time. A lot of times people don't know how to be with grief. Um, and how important is community when we're talking about grief?
yes, I think I'm biased here because I'm very pro community, no matter what state we're in. But certainly when we're in grief, I think it's particularly important to have somebody be an accurate mirror of ourselves. I think where when our mental health isn't doing so great is often when maybe we're in community, but we're in community with people who aren't giving us very accurate reflections of ourselves. And that that causes all sorts of levels of distress when we're not being
Mm-hmm.
seen
Mm-hmm.
accurately. And
Mm-hmm.
so certainly then when we're grieving, I think it's extra important to be around people, but at least one other person who can really, and who maybe has experienced it, or if they haven't experienced it, can really accept that this is where we're at right now. Sometimes I hear patients talk about how they feel as though they have to be over a loss after a certain time, and that they can't talk about it with friends anymore. And so what I sometimes say is, also on the flip side, if you want to support somebody who's grieving, I think it can feel useful sometimes to ask, what would feel supportive to them. So would you like me to ask about the person or the animal that you lost, or finding out a little bit more about like what would feel good for them in your relationship with them while they're grieving. Because I think sometimes around grief, specifically, sometimes people can be afraid, I think, to interact with the person who's grieving because they don't want to cause them more distress. They don't know what to say. And so then I think they don't say anything. And that doesn't always feel good then for the person who's grieving. So not being afraid to ask questions about like, what would you like right now? What would feel good? What would feel supportive for you?
Yeah. And I love that you bring up, it could just be one person too. Like, it's
Mhm.
like, it doesn't, when I say the word community, I think of multiple people, but, there are certain people that I speak to in my life about grief around certain topics, right? Like I would go to, like, when I lost Sully, our mutual friend, Lisa Mullinax, that girl knew what to say any given moment. I was like, man, you're like a Hallmark card, girl. Like
Mhm.
she just, she was so present to my experience and just said sorry, like was like, I know this is really, really hard, right? Like really holding space for that. It was hard. And then asking if it would be okay if she shared her experience losing an animal. And that felt really good to me because I wanted to hear how someone else lived through that experience. And yeah, like having particular people in your life to lean on in that way is can be a real gift. And I guess I want to say that with a caveat that, Lisa nailed it, but not everybody does, right? Because not everybody knows what to do or like isn't used to having that conversation. And there is the same way that we're meeting our dogs and meeting ourselves where we are throughout this grief process, we need to meet our community where they are too, which is another layer of responsibility and could be additional grief, right? Like, if my sister doesn't know how to show up, it's like, oh, that is hard for me. And we're all doing the best that we can, given what our experiences are. And some people may meet you this way and some people may meet you this way. And I think that when you are grieving and you do find the community that feels best to you, like lean into that, right? Not expecting everyone to be the community.
Yes. And if we can harness some level of mindfulness as we're experiencing grief, it can be so useful to, especially when we're interacting with somebody, family, friends that historically just haven't
Mhm.
hit the mark in terms of
Yeah.
emotional
Mhm.
attunement.
Yeah.
Um, then it can be extra important to ask for what you need in those moments.
Hmm.
So, I'm just thinking of times where I've done this, where I've asked the other person, I've said something like, um, right now I actually, I don't need advice. What would feel really good to me is if um, you could just ask me questions, or you could validate how I'm feeling,
Totally.
right?
Yes.
And that's such a great thing, I think, also for the relationship, that you're bringing an authenticity that maybe wasn't there before. You're also communicating your needs. And so it's making it easier for the other person to meet your needs.
Hmm.
That might be
Yeah.
something else to think about.
I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, Belinda, thank you so much for being on the show, talking about a topic that much needed airtime. So I appreciate your expertise and all of your just how you talk about this and shine light on all of it. It's just been a beautiful conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Where can folks find you online?
I have very little online presence, but if folks wanted to reach out, I'm always happy to connect, and you can email me. A good email is brbreen@ucdavis.edu, and I can give that to
Awesome.
Marissa too, so she can.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Appreciate you too.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Paws and Reward podcast. If you want to find me, Marissa Martino, visit pawsandreward.com or check me out over on Instagram, Paws and Reward. See you soon.